First of all, good morning, and thank you for coming out on a beautiful Saturday morning to listen to us talk for a few minutes. And usually this takes about a half an hour or so, and then we have some time for questions at the end. But my name is Steve Thurlow, and the lady sitting in the center there is Suzanne Charbonneau, and we work for Dillon Consulting, and we've been retained by the municipality to help them develop a fire master plan. What is a fire master plan? Very simply, it is a comprehensive review of the department. So every division, all of the activities that the department currently provides, and then what we do is we look at the legislation that's in place and to ensure that the municipality, A, is meeting their legislated responsibilities, and B, if they're not in any area, look at what strategies would have to be put in place so that they could meet those legislated standards. At the same time, we look at best practices. That's an important part of the evaluation to ensure that all of the services from a best practices perspective represent what's going on in the fire service industry today. Ultimately, what we will prepare is a document that will form a framework for the next 5 years to 10 years for the department. And what it becomes is a very significant document for council and certain senior staff within the fire department to look where the fire department is today and where they want it to go over that horizon. So ultimately, 5 to 10 years on the first horizon. In this particular instance, council has wants us to look at 20 years, in part because of the growth happening in the municipality and planned to happen in the municipality. There are a couple of major nodes that development is being considered right now. As I mentioned, the legislated responsibility is a key part of the work we do, both within the FPPA, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, all of the relevant standards. And one of the reasons you're sitting here this morning is to ensure that we engage the community and stakeholders in the process. And it's a core component of the fire master plan process that the Office of the Fire Marshal has prepared, and it's one we as a consultant firm believe is really, really important. So who's involved in it? Well, to date, we have a steering committee that council has put together here with the assistance of the fire chief. It's fairly extensive, listed there, right from the fire chief through all of the different divisions of the department, certainly political with the mayor and the CAO, and then right down through some of the core pieces of the planning process, such as the manager of land use planning, and then we have the representation from the two groups, being the full-time firefighters and the volunteer firefighters. So I talked about legislation. The FPPA, or the Fire Protection and Prevention Act, is the key piece. What you see on the screen are the two components that every municipality must do. So there's no question here. This is the mandated pieces. One of the most important pieces is referenced in number B that talks about needs and circumstances. So the plan we build has to be based on the municipality's needs and circumstances. And I can tell you in my experience, there are no two municipalities that are the same. Either from a risk perspective, a geography, or demographic, your building stock, there are uniquenesses in every one of our clients, in every municipality's needs and circumstances. In regards to public education specifically, the Act and certainly the Fire Marshal's Office reflects that these are the minimum that that program should include. So we have a simplified risk assessment, which the department currently creates, a smoke alarm program, fire safety education activities, which is a very, very important component, and we'll talk about that as we go through the presentation. And then from a fire inspection perspective, they must respond to complaints, or if anyone in the community makes a request with regard to a code compliance issue. Then on the fire protection side, this is where I'll refer to, again, needs and circumstances. So fire protection is based on ultimately the level of risk within the community, and then council's determination through a number of factors such as the fire risk, the liability, the finances, and to eventually, and they will through this process, set a standard for the fire protection component. In Ontario, certainly over the past 5 years, this model has become more and more predominant as the framework for how to create one of these plans and for how the fire service in Ontario has evolved. And it's certainly a leading edge framework. It's called the 3 lines of defense. As you see on the screen, public education and prevention are number 1. Then number 2, fire safety standards and enforcement. And the third one being emergency response or actual firefighting. What we have found in our experience in talking to clients that if you do very well with the first 2 lines of defense, you can have a positive impact on the third, meaning that you can certainly reduce call volume in some areas. We've seen that with clients, or at least manage them. But more importantly, together, these provide a very effective community fire safety plan. Our approach. Let's see how many we lose. So we have a little hesitation here because 3 of the members of our group here this morning are volunteer firefighters, and they've just left. So it just shows that the system works. Our approach to this project is laid out on the slide in front of you. It's 6 phases. We have completed phase 1, which is the project initiation. Site visits refers to the fact that we visit each of the stations to look at the apparatus, the equipment, the status, what type of equipment. We use this process to gather all of the historical data and information from the department. Phase 2 is the non-suppression, so everything other than firefighting. That includes the fire prevention, public education, as we talked about, training, communications. Then we look at the suppression component, and as we'll go through here, we'll show you some slides on risk and where the current stations are located. Phase 3 involves us beginning to develop some preliminary recommendations, observations, and our thoughts on how the department should move forward over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And then phase 4 being public consultation, where we are today. So we have completed a number of components of the stakeholder consultation, but this morning and through this process, we will do our best to engage the public in the development of the Fire Master Plan. As we move forward, we have 2 phases left to complete. One will be us preparing a draft report to present back to the steering committee, and then ultimately we will present a final report to council. So just a couple of thoughts on what we have seen today and some of the progress the department has made just since we've been working on this project over the last 2.5 to 3 months. The first being the relocation of the fire prevention officer to headquarters. Certainly a more effective time management in our view, and supports, I think, the direction of the plan to put more emphasis on fire prevention education. The chief and the deputy have been working with us to collect more data that was not collected prior to this process, and some of it just to increase what they were collecting, firefighter training attendance. We are aware that the municipality has been negotiating a new dispatch agreement with Barrie. That's in the final stages of being adopted and implemented. And again, we think that's an excellent strategy for the community. And they have been doing some participation in live fire training, but you will see through the presentation that's an area of concern for us. And the fire chief has actually submitted some applications for infrastructure because he's well aware of the infrastructure needs of the department with regards to the stations. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. Preliminary observations, the chief and deputy are relatively new to the municipality. They're certainly doing well on the transition, beginning to understand, again, what some of the needs and circumstances are, understanding the risks. They have come into a department that is in the transition towards a new records management system. Firehouse is the software that has been selected, and in our experience, it's one of the leading-edge software program providers for the fire service. And records management is an important component of this master plan. We've, as I said, walked through all of the stations and looked at the infrastructure. Just from an observation perspective, the picture that's on that slide is the headquarters station. It is very limited with regard to certainly any future staff requirements or storage space. It's at its maximum. We've also identified, and we'll talk a little bit more about the other two stations, which one of which has certainly reached, I would suggest, its life expectancy. It's a matter of fact, as of this morning, not even being used as a fire station due to some challenges. And the amenities within the two of the outlying stations certainly don't reflect what would be best practices for a public building and certainly a fire station operation today. I spoke briefly about the fire prevention officer. That list in front of you is just a high-level look at some of the roles simply assigned to that one person. That's a fairly extensive list that not only includes prevention and education activities, but actually includes an operational role as incident safety officer. That's an area of concern for us that we will look at as we walk through the plan. We've also noticed that there's an absence of a formal fire prevention inspection cycle that we would like to see approved by council. Again, council, as I've talked about, legislatively sets the service standards, and so that document will need to be created and presented to council for consideration. We'd suggest that one of the reasons that cycle's not in place is because of the challenges the department currently has simply to maintain some type of a fire inspection level. They do well on what they're doing, but it's more responsive rather than being proactive. And I'd suggest it's not necessarily based on the risks that we'll identify through the community risk profile that we develop. Similarly, on the public education side, I'd suggest from a workload perspective, as you can see by the list of the individual who's primarily assigned to that role, we're at a maximum. So as we look to enhance those two first lines of defense, one of the challenges we see will be where do the resources and people and the hours come to do that from? A number of the observations on this particular slide relate to training, and training within the fire service, and particularly a composite department such as this, is always a challenge, particularly under the occupational health and safety area where there are a number of mandated programs, and certainly records management is one of them. Not uncommon to a composite department. This particular department is having a challenge, not simply to deliver it and who's delivering it, but what certifications are in place. And as I've said, the time constraints and just the number of hours required, not just to deliver it, but even to attend it, certainly on the volunteer side. We've talked about the fact that the department's transitioning to Firehouse as a records management software. Training is an area they are beginning to work on that way, and that's an important part of the occupational health and safety side, is that the department is well positioned for an audit at any time, 24/7, to just represent all of the training that happens within the department. Next bullet talks about attendance requirements. That's specifically geared to the volunteer side, and it is becoming harder and harder in the volunteer service within Ontario to simply sustain a level of training. There's been a high amount of turnover within the volunteers, which is not uncommon. Part of that has been through a reduction of inactive staff. Again, not uncommon in the fire service, where it takes a significant amount of commitment on behalf of the volunteers to participate, and training is becoming more and more a part of that. And so as we work through this plan, one of the things we will look at is any areas where we can manage or mitigate the commitment to training or prioritize it, anything that will help reduce some of that workload on the volunteers as we move forward. Recruitment and retention of volunteer firefighters in Ontario is a significant challenge, particularly as communities evolve as urban centers and as people's work-life balance change. We don't typically see the 30, 35, 40, and 45-year volunteers that we would have seen a few decades ago. A lot of the newer volunteers are actually entering the service to become full-time, and so that creates a significant challenge for municipalities to maintain the type of model that we have in Innisfil, which is a composite department. I've mentioned live fire training. The department has begun to introduce this where possible, but one of the challenges, or the challenge, is the fact they do not have access to a live fire training facility locally. They have to travel extensively in order to accommodate that. So that's an area we'll look at and certainly have discussions with the town staff about what opportunities might lie out in front. Officer training is a key component of any training program. The department is doing some initiatives in this area, but it's certainly where we would like to see a very comprehensive training program designed around the provincial company officer accreditation, but to give them skills that may be outside of just simply being a firefighter. Specialized training bullet there reflects the aerial truck that the department has, which is a very unique piece of apparatus and requires a significant amount of training simply to meet the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Okay, Suzanne? Just a couple of the other observations that the department currently participates in a tiered response agreement with the ambulance service. One option that has been discussed and is being thought about is a transition to a B-level tiered response from an A. Not uncommon in the fire service in Ontario today. We have a number of clients looking at and actually making this shift. It can have a significant impact on call volume, reducing the number of calls the department responds to. But in our experience, it has not to date had any effect on public service, certainly from our perspective and the clients we've dealt with. We talked about the dispatch agreement. That's moving forward. One other piece that we'll be looking at as we move through this plan is where opportunities for automatic aid might exist. And automatic aid is, in simple terms, looking at are there other fire stations closer to areas of Innisfil that may help in providing a certain level of staffing or an initial response to fires within Innisfil. And so those are just three municipalities that certainly form the majority of the boundary that we'll be looking at where their locations are and whether automatic aid or another frame for it as fire protection agreements may be available. So some of the options that we're looking at, I've mentioned tiered response agreement. We are currently looking at that in depth and the protocols that are within it and whether there is an opportunity to look at either a B level or a modified A to, again, reduce some of the stress on the department for the number of calls that they respond to with regard to medical responses. We are currently working through a fire station location study of the 4 fire stations, and I'll show you another map in a couple of minutes that will reflect some of the reasons why. The modeling we do it's certainly based on best practices. It's going to look at a number of options, such as whether there is any ability to combine two of the stations or any mixture of the stations that are there, so that we can address the overall response to the community. For most people that understand, there's a significant development plan for Big Bay Point, which at the northern tip of the municipality, we through this process are going to have to consider how fire protection will be provided to that area. Excuse me. And again, looking at any kind of a partnership opportunity or shared facility, either with groups such as Hydro or the police services or ambulance services. And in our experience, shared facilities provides a very proactive, economically viable opportunity for the fire service. I've talked about automatic aid agreements, and again, those are just 3 municipalities. And then I will show you in a slide the initial look at our community risk model that follows the fire master planning process and the guidelines provided by the fire marshal's office. So some of the key challenges that we've seen pretty much about 50% way through the study right now. The new management team in the process of understanding the municipality and certainly beginning to meet and interact with both the full-time and volunteer staff. I'd suggest they are looking to this fire master plan as an important component of developing their strategic plan for the future. We've talked about training, certainly the standards, and the time commitment, certainly on the volunteer side, is becoming more and more predominant. The station facilities and locations, the picture that happens to be on that slide is a station that when we started this study had fire trucks in it. I don't believe it has fire trucks in it anymore as a result of some infrastructure challenges that the station has. So again, looking at the stations themselves physically and from an infrastructure position, and then again looking at their locations to optimize the travel times and response times is certainly an area that we'll be looking at quite soon, actually, given the current circumstances. Daytime response deals again with the volunteers. It is not uncommon for daytime, Monday to Friday, typical business hours for a municipality to have challenge in dispatching volunteer firefighters. 3 or 4 decades ago, volunteer firefighters were able to leave their place of work. They worked very close to the fire stations, and this wasn't a concern. As life goes on, and as I said, work-life balance and other priorities, having volunteers as part of a daytime response is very difficult to achieve, certainly consistently. So that's an area that we are looking at right now on what other options there are, and we'll be talking specifically to the volunteers about what challenges they may see on what the problem is today and how we can look at future strategies to improve that. Turnout times, again, reflect to both the full-time and the volunteers. It's an important component of an overall response time. Turnout time is the time from when the fire station or the individuals receive the call from dispatch, and then that goes until the truck actually starts on the road. There are some standards for that. There are some best practices for that. And unfortunately, up until this time, the department has not specifically tracked that. So we are working with them to identify those times for a good period of time, such as the last 2 to 3 years. Similarly, those turnout times have an effect on the overall response times. Again, there are a number of standards that we can look at and best practices. which leads to the next bullet that talks about firefighter deployment. In our experience, if you break down firefighter deployment into two components, the first one being first response or initial response, we would suggest best practices looks at an amount of 4 firefighters either responding on the first truck or assembling on scene simultaneously as best practices. And again, we'll look at the department's current capability to do that and what it might take to achieve something like that first response. On the depth side, similarly, from our view, a best practices would reflect that having 14 firefighters assemble on a scene of a typical fire in a building such as a single-family residence, 2-story with hydrant protection. In the scenario we use, it doesn't have a basement. We will be looking at how the department achieves that today, what options might be in place for it to improve the level of service that they have, such as things like I talked about with automatic aid or a fire protection agreement with another municipality. And when we look at the picture of the municipality in one of the slides coming up, we can talk a little bit about that. We've mentioned the future development of Big Bay Point. It's a significant development. It happens to be on the outskirts of the municipality at the very north end. And again, we'll be looking at a number of different strategies on how fire protection could be provided to that type of such a big development and on the extremity of the municipality. All of that above will be measured against the 3 lines of defense. In our report, we will talk significantly about if we do the first 2 lines of defense very, very well, it can have a very positive impact on the overall fire protection within the community. So I've mentioned the maps a couple of times. There is a current GIS map of the municipality that we've prepared. What you see, hopefully clearly in the purple with the 4 red bullets, is the location of the current 4 fire stations. The blue represents for us what a typical response travel time would be in under 4 minutes. So that's simply measuring the time from when the truck leaves the station to see how far it can travel in 4 minutes under normal response protocols. You'll see a little border around the blue that's somewhat of a yellow, lighter color. That adds an extra minute, so that tells us in 5 minutes or less just how far they can travel. And then in the red, so the darker color simply represents the travel times in excess of 5 minutes. And we simply use those travel times just simply to start to create this type of a GIS model to give us some indication of what the municipality's capabilities are. One of the things that little exercise does is present a picture like this, whereby if you look at Station 1 currently where it's located, and from a common sense perspective, you simply look at the fact that almost 40 to 45% of what would be the normal coverage area actually happens to be water. So the station's physically located very, very close to the edge of the lake, and therefore it loses a significant amount of coverage that if it was further to the west it would have. Similarly with Station 2, it has a little corner missing. And if you look at all of them, you start to see some consistency, which is actually an explanation on how the municipality came to being in the fact that it's an amalgamated municipality. This very clearly represents the 4 previous communities and the fact that in those days the fire station was located within the core urban center of the hamlet and or community that developed. And what we have there is the representation of that. Our challenge is to work with the fire chief and staff now to think about, as a fire department, how are we going to provide a level of service to all of the rest of the areas of the municipality And when we look at growth, just for example on this slide, places like Big Bay Point. Okay. This particular map is the beginning of our risk assessment. What you can see in the agenda on the right-hand side are the 4 levels of risk that we create following the Fire Marshal's Public Fire Safety Guideline for firefighter deployment. So we have a low risk, a moderate risk, a high risk, and an extreme risk level. And we work through the major building classifications of the Ontario Building Code and the Planning Act to develop what we consider are the risks. I can explain to you that, in our view, a moderate risk would be that same scenario of a single-family, 2-story dwelling with hydrant protection. So we consistently go back to the same fire risk scenario. And what you can see on the map is the beginning of us plotting the last 3 years of call volume data. Not the last 3 years of call volume data, but the data of explaining where each level of risk is. So you'll see it somewhat looks like someone's marked a bunch of dots on the map. A good deal of that comes from the information from the municipality. Some of it comes from the various ministries across the province. So we use every type of a GIS layer we can find to plot all of the different occupancies. So if you look at the basically the orange moderate risk, you start to see how spread out a lot of the residential and risk areas are. And then you can start to see where there are the pools or the smaller groups of communities. So obviously in the various station areas, it reflects the high density areas. But if you look just north of Station 1, you start to see a fairly large, what represents development. And you can start to see some other areas where there are smaller hamlet areas, typically at cross corners. So we through this process need to start to look at how are we providing fire protection as a whole to those areas. You'll see a few red dots which reflect a high risk, which is typically an institutional type of use. It could be an old age home, a senior center, could be the hospital, might be a school. So far in this analysis, you won't find an extreme risk on that map, and I don't suspect we will find that type of a fire risk within the municipality. We may find 1 or 2 as we dig deeper in as we go, but it's not common to find an extreme risk. Okay, Suzanne? So in summary, where we're at, we've had 2 steering committees to date. Working with the list I expressed to you earlier, we've interviewed all of the staff within the department from a management perspective and key staff from the municipality. We've conducted a workshop with council to present very, very similar information to what we've presented here this morning, and to get some of their feedback on what the process is and to ensure they understand their legislative responsibility. This morning we're conducting the open house, again targeted at getting the public's reaction, input, and ideas. We have yet to, but have planned consultation sessions with all of the volunteer stations and the full-time firefighters as a group, and also interviews with each member of council to get their own views on their own elected areas. And then finally, we will hold our last meeting with the steering committee to present our preliminary report and then the final report to council. So some of the questions we have for the public are on the screen right now, and I'll leave them for a minute for you to look at. There are a number of ways we can seek public input. One is absolutely this morning through this discussion with myself and Suzanne on those questions or any other questions. We will provide you, following this slide, an email address whereby anyone can provide us comments over the next 2 to 3 weeks, and we will feed that into the process. We have comment sheets here this morning for you if you would like to fill them out and leave them with us. And ultimately that package together will form the public input into the plan. Go ahead, Suzanne. So on the slide is Suzanne's email address, which brings information to our team. And we'll leave that up. It is on the comment sheets. But Suzanne, could we just go back to the previous slide? So that pretty much ends the presentation. So thank you very much.